Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, A Year in the Life of a Polar Bear, 2023 edition, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Eleanor Edye. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here today. Over to you, Eleanor.
All right. Hello, everybody, and thanks, Rob, for the lovely intro as always. So like Rob said, my name's Eleanor. I'm one of the expedition leaders here with Natural Habitat Adventures, and I spend a lot of my time thinking about bears, whether they're black bears or brown bears or polar bears. Bears have a big part in my life, and I'd love to share some information with you, especially as we are right now at one of the probably actually the most important time of year for polar bears. So we are now kind of approaching our summer months and exciting things are happening with polar bears. So I am one of our Canadian ELs. I lead a lot of trips in Churchill, Manitoba, which is where Natural Habitat runs our polar bear adventure tours. With that, you can kind of guess that I can spend a lot of time talking about polar bears. I will do my very best to keep this to an hour to respect everybody's time and give us a introduction and a snapshot of what's happening with the bears right now and go over some polar bear biology and adaptations to life on the ice. So let's start out with some basic polar bear facts and then get you into the year in the life, a year in the life of a bear. A life in the year of a bear? A year in the life of a bear. There we go. That took a while. Sorry about that. So, a little bit about the polar bear. Its scientific name is Ursus maritimus. This means the maritime or the sea bear. In some other languages, it directly translates locally as the ice bear, which makes sense to a lot of us. We'll talk about how ice is the habitat, but ultimately they are a creature of the ocean, whether that ocean is solid as sea ice or liquid. Globally, the population estimates are somewhere between 22,000 to 31,000 individuals. And if you're reading up on polar bears online, you'll probably see the number 25,000 thrown around. That's a pretty commonly used middle of the road global estimate of how many there are around there. Now, polar bears, I mentioned I think about bears a lot, and polar bears being one of them. There are a good number of bear species that are currently living in the world, and there have been more bear species that have lived in the past. We recognize these bears currently shown on the screen as being extant, meaning currently living bears. And this is a rough kind of guideline to how far back they speciated away from the rest of the bears. So if you look on the left-hand side there, you can see the giant panda. This is one of our very ancient bear species. It's separated out from the remainder of the bears quite early on. We estimate somewhere between 20 and 30 million years back. Whereas if you look on the right-hand side, we have the polar bear and the brown bear. You'll hear me using the word brown bear as an aside here. Brown bears are a group of bears that includes grizzly bears. So brown bear is our generic term. Grizzly bears are a specific location type of brown bear. So the polar bears and the brown bears are the most recent speciations that have happened. And our estimates as to when the polar bears became a separate species from the brown bear range, depending, which paper you read and what type of evidence you're looking at, anywhere from 100,000 years back to around 600,000 years, and some estimates even go as far back as 2 million years ago. This is likely confused when we start looking at genetic evidence by the fact that these two species are actually still able to interbreed. And when you have interbreeding events happening, it really does throw a wrench into your genetic surveys. But regardless, we know that there was a time before now that we didn't have polar bears, and now we do. And that time is somewhere between, like I said, around the early estimates range from 100,000 years, that's probably way too early, back to around 2 million years ago, and we use usually around 500,000 years ago to be our middle of the road estimate on how long polar bears have been a species. terms of how they got here, they did evolve directly from the brown bear. So we know that the polar bears separated out genetically from brown bears. Now, how this happens, there's a number of possible scenarios as to how this occurred. You can think of a story as to how this happened, that sometime, maybe around 600,000 years ago, there were no polar bears. There were only, in the northern areas, brown bears. Now, at this time, this was a time of global cooling when we saw ice sheets moving across the land and we saw sea ice expanding dramatically, and a lot of habitats that normally would have been used by brown bears got lost. This new habitat instead was opening up, and it was a habitat of ice and a habitat that was used by animals like seals and other marine mammals like whales underwater. This habitat may not have been very suitable for a brown bear, but it may have been suitable for a subset of brown bears. Now, when you look at this image here, you may think that you're looking at a brown bear and a polar bear. But in fact, if you look at these bears, you'll be able to tell that they're both actually brown bears. One is simply a light variation of a brown bear color. Brown bears can come in many different colors. They can be brown, they can be quite dark, they can be cinnamon, but they can also be blonde. And some of the thoughts are that this light color was extremely advantageous to bears that were living on the ice. And because there was such a visual separation and a separation in terms of the habitat that they were using, that this new subset of bears began to speciate and develop adaptations for the ice habitat, with selection favoring those with light coats because they're living on the sea ice. So this here is a polar bear here. And if I flip back for a second to our last slide, you'll see some differences here, namely to do with the shape of the head. You can look at this polar bear for a second. You'll see how streamlined the head is, how small the ears are, whereas our brown bears have larger ears and a more, we call it a dish-shaped face. So it's almost a concave face. But the polar bear has evolved to be highly specialized to life on the sea ice, and it's done so very rapidly and very well, with a number of evolutionary features I'll point out as we go through our year in the life of a bear. So let's look at where they exist. As I mentioned, our population estimates, midline gives us around 25,000 individuals globally. They're found in the circumpolar area, meaning this map here is looking down at the North Pole and then at the surrounding nations of the North Pole. So we find polar bears in 5 different nations: the US, represented by Alaska; Canada, represented by our 3 northern territories, as well as occasional offshoots into places like Quebec and Newfoundland. Also by Denmark, because of the Greenland population, as Greenland is administered by Denmark. Norway has a stake in the polar bears as well, because there's a Svalbard population. That's a very northerly island off the northern tip of Norway, as well as Russia has populations of polar bears as well. They do occasionally pop up elsewhere. You'll see, for example, that on this map, Iceland isn't shown as having a polar bear population because there's no resident population there. Occasionally, one will drift in on the sea ice, but these are our recognized populations. And of those, there are 19 of those. Now, a lot of these populations are in very, very remote areas, and we're actually really unaware of a lot of things that happen there. For example, the middle of this map, we have a population called the Arctic Basin population. This is a population centered around the North Pole. It's an area that's incredibly remote, characterized by really thick multi-year sea ice. Imagine how difficult it is to do population surveys of polar bears in a huge remote area like that. They simply really don't happen. So when we look at this map, you're going to see a white filled circle telling us that we have a data deficient area. We just don't know how many polar bears are realistically found in that area. For the populations that have a filled in circle, that gives you a rough idea how large the population is. And those are populations that do have very good population surveys. The color of the populations on the map shows us the general trend. For our white areas of the map, it's unknown or it's stable. Sorry, data deficient is what I mean to say. Our stable populations are shown as blue, meaning that we've seen no change year over year from the last time of surveying the population to this current round of surveys. Yellow populations are increasing populations, and red populations are populations that are decreasing in number relative to the last round of surveys and through their overall trends. Now, as I talk about polar bears, I am going to be focusing on one particular subpopulation, and that is the Western Hudson Bay subpopulation. And I talk about it because it's where I work. It's the population that's found in and around Churchill. And if you look as to where to find it on the map, you can see that there are 3 subpopulations that are colored in red. It is the middle of those 3, so the lower left-hand side represents our Western Hudson Bay population, and unfortunately it is one that is going through decline. When you're looking at this map here and you're looking at where those red ones are, we'll talk about sea ice for the polar bears, but it probably won't come as a surprise to see that our southernmost populations of polar bears are the ones seeing a decline at the moment because of loss of sea ice due to global climate change. So that's a little snapshot of where the bears are and some of the populations. Let's start going through a year in the life of a bear, and we'll start with spring. Spring is the most important time to a bear, and it is important for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it is the most important time for the bear to get its needed calories. This image here, I can tell that this is a spring image for a couple of reasons. The biggest reason I can tell it's a spring image is that we have a couple of birds flying in the upper right-hand corner. Those are glaucous gulls. They migrate up in the spring and they will scavenge bear leftovers. I can also guess that it's spring because while bears will take seals during the winter, they are much more successful at catching seals in the springtime. And in fact, for most bears, the only time that they're not in caloric deficit is during the springtime. So every other time of year, probably 9 months out of the year, they are not getting enough calories to sustain their daily needs. And it's only in the springtime that there is an excess of calories that they then have to store for later on. And if you're wondering when spring is, if you're a polar bear, well, guess what? It's right now. I'm saying this while my outdoor temperatures in southern Manitoba are into the 90s. If you're thinking Fahrenheit, it's very hot where I am, but it's not so hot still up in the Arctic. So what are they hunting while they're out there in the spring? They are primarily hunting the ringed seal. The ringed seal is also a circumpolar species, meaning it's found all around the Arctic. It is the smallest of all seal species, and it is also the most common species in the Arctic, and most commonly found inside a polar bear's tummy. Polar bears will also, however, eat whatever they can get their paws on. This may include walrus, harp seal, hooded seal, harbor seal, as well as our whales like narwhal, bowhead, and beluga. Now, if you look at the range map of our ringed seal, you can see it basically fully overlaps with the area used by polar bears. So really, polar bears use the area used by ringed seals. If you're going to have a polar bear in an area, it's likely going to co-occur with ringed seals. Now, while our polar bears were estimated 25,000 global numbers, our ringed seal numbers are quite a bit higher, estimated 5 million individuals across the world in our circumpolar area. Like I said, they're fairly small seals. They're about 4 feet long at maturity, up to around 150 pounds. And for your average bear to meet its average caloric needs, they will have to consume approximately 43 ringed seals per year. Sounds like a lot, and I'm sure it sounds like a lot if you're a ringed seal, but if we think about the size of a polar bear, that's actually, maybe not so bad, because they are quite efficient when it comes to digesting food. Now, how do they catch these seals? Why are they hunting them so much in the springtime? Well, springtime is the time of plenty for a couple of reasons. Firstly, this seal here in the image on the right, it is sunning itself. And this is something that ringed seals do in the springtime. So they will haul themselves out on the ice to sun themselves, and this is actually also the time that they are molting. So they will replace their fur in the springtime while they lie on the ice in the sun. And it can actually get quite warm on the sea ice as that late spring sun beams down on it. So seals are just out of the water more often in the springtime, whereas normally they are found, of course, underwater. So that's one reason why it's easier for polar bears to get ringed seals in the spring. The other reason is that this is also the time of year when the ringed seals are having their pups, and they are awfully cute pups. Those ringed seals use very, very specific habitat in the ice. They don't just go anywhere willy-nilly where there's sea ice. They require stable ice, meaning that it's ice usually attached to the shore, not very far out from shore at all, where there are pressure ridges and accumulated snow. So it's usually where the ice, we call it shore-fast ice, the ice that attaches to the shore, meets up with ice that is moving with the current. And as that moving ice spins around and pushes up against the shore-fast ice, it often causes these pressure ridges where ice will pop up and form a little bit of shelter. This is where these seals will build their dens. At the time of birth, these pups, each female will give birth to one pup every year. They're about 10 pounds at birth. If you think about it, that kind of makes sense. It's roughly human-sized pup, roughly human-sized adult. But by 6 weeks old, you can compare this to humans as well. At 6 weeks old, how much do humans weigh? Well, not really more than 10 pounds. We don't really get big very fast, but a ring seal pup at 6 weeks old is 50 to 60 pounds. So they put on weight rapidly, and a lot of that weight is fat. So they're consuming very, very high fat milk from their mom, putting on that weight really quickly so that when they're weaned at the 6 to 7 week mark, they are big and blubbery and able to survive in that cold Arctic water. Well, if you are a polar bear, this is like the ring seal smorgasbord for you. You have a number of seals in the 6 week period that are either very small or very fat, and somewhere in between that during the popping stage, they are not really able to go in the water because they're not well insulated yet. They are kind of dumb, they're very young, and very slow. So nearly half the estimates, nearly half of these ring seal pups will be killed by polar bears before they even get a chance to go for their very first swim. It's a hard life being a ring seal because those polar bears, oh, they are well-designed killing machines. They've got 42 teeth to grab those pups, crush their skulls, and then tear through the flesh. Like other bears, polar bears are technically omnivores because they do consume things like berries and kelp, but we actually consider them to be obligate carnivores because they rely on meat for their needed calories. So even though they're capable of consuming, vegetable matter, that is not what they require for their sustenance, and polar bears can get by just fine without ever eating a berry or a piece of kelp. So specifically, they eat, and they will preferentially eat the fat off a ring seal. In fact, sometimes these bears, if they come across a ring seal den, they pull the pup out and it's a newborn that doesn't have a lot of fat on it yet, they'll actually just abandon it and walk away from it. It's not even worth the work of chewing on it. That is how much they want fat as mature bears. Now, this is not an image of a dead bear, by the way. This is an image taken of a tranquilized bear by a researcher when they were doing bear surveys in the springtime. These bears, using those front teeth, will usually peel the fatty layer, the blubber layer, right off of those seals, leaving the muscle behind. That muscle, that protein source, will then go on to be scavenged either by younger bears that are not able to easily take ring seals or defend their own kills, also by other scavengers like those glaucous gulls we talked about, and like polar bears have an incredible metabolic efficiency for fat. They can uptake 98% of the calories that they eat. Thank goodness humans aren't able to do that. I'll let you think about what happened if you were able to put 98% of the butter that you ate directly onto your hips. It's good for the bear. It's less good for us with an excess of calories. And they are less efficient with protein, around 78% efficiency for protein metabolism. Just a quick shot of what's following them around, because polar bears, we think of them as being at top of the Arctic food chain, and they very much are, but there are things that follow behind them and also have things to do with the bears and the seals. So there's our glaucous skull, the scavenger of many a polar bear kill, and you can see them following along behind in the springtime. Another scavenger. All right, see if you can find it in this image. That's obviously a kill site. You can see the remnants of what got left behind. So a lot of blood streaks on the ice, and then maybe a few little pieces in the middle of that there. And then just above that, you can see an Arctic fox in its white form running away from the helicopter. So Arctic fox is often on cleanup crew for polar bears. Some Arctic fox will remain on land during the winter, but many of them, a large proportion of them, will head out in the springtime to clean up after the polar bears. Now, this is likely a springtime photo as well, because our Arctic foxes are there. Also because I can see that we have a lot of open water as well as pressure built up. So this would be an example of a good site for a seal den. Feels wrong to say good site because obviously it was predated, it wasn't that good, but this is the kind of area that we would find seal dens in. Access to a lead to swim out. We have buildup of snow pressure ridges and accumulated snow for those den sites. Now, feeding is, of course, something really, really important that happens in the springtime, but it's not the only important thing that's happening in the springtime. Springtime is also breeding time, the time of love. There's a few reasons for that. The biggest reason is that it's actually the only time of year that bears are likely to be in the same place and at the same time, because those seal pupping areas, while not exactly defined, they'll change a little bit year to year. They're always in the same general area, and that's always where the bears want to be. These bears that you can see here, and you can see some blood on the larger one of these bears, this is not a male-female pair fighting. This is actually two males fighting for access to a female. Now, bears can be difficult to sex at a distance. There's a few things here that are jumping out at me, telling me that these are both males. If I look at both of these bears, even though one's smaller, they've both got very long, what are called guard hairs on the back of their front legs. So those are thought to be a type of sexual display with those long hairs. And then if you look at the bear on the right-hand side, you get a look at a very obvious when you see it, but sometimes very subtle thing. The hairs hanging down between that bear's legs are guard hairs on the penis of the male bear. So whenever you see those hairs hanging down on the back abdomen of a bear, you can be very sure that you're looking at a male, because females will not have any guard hairs in that location. And often that's the easiest way that we can sex a bear. Now, there is very, very fierce competition for mates, as you might be getting an idea of this image here. In terms of why, well, we'll talk about in a minute how long female bears keep their cubs. They mostly keep them around 2.5 years. During that 2.5 years, they will not be receptive to mating. They will not accept a mate because they are already looking after a young. At that time, then on any given year, 2/3 of the female population is not available and receptive to breeding, meaning that for every one girl who's looking to make a cub that year, there are 3 boys out there, which means that likely they are going to fight for access to that breeding female. They are sexually mature around the age of 6, but because of this very intense fighting that has to happen for access to females, most males aren't successful at breeding until they're about 10 years or older, because they have to be the biggest, baddest guy on the block to be able to access those females. This type of behavior is actually really dangerous to our polar bears. It can give us things like this. Do you see anything missing in this bear's mouth? Perhaps you notice that its upper left, looks like on the right side of the image to us, canine is missing. Damages to the dentition like this are one of the things that can cause early mortality to our male bears. We know that male bears die earlier on average than females do, and this fighting during breeding season is likely a main reason for this. The bear's teeth are his tools. He has to be able to hunt and kill seals or other marine mammals to feed himself. And if he can't do that because he's got broken teeth, he's not going to be a successful hunter. This bear may also have an infection later on, it's possible that it may get quite bad for this bear, but it is part of the natural cycle. Now this image here is of a male and female. I bet you can guess which one is the male. It's the one on the left, because this extreme sexual competition has led to extreme sexual dimorphism, meaning that males and females look extremely different. Now to us, if you see a bear at a distance, you might squint and say, is that a male, a female? I can't tell, because they kind of look the same, right? But if you see a male and a female, like a mature male and female beside each other, you would have no question about which is which, because the males are about 2 to 3 times the size of the females. Females will weigh at maturity between 350 to 550 pounds. Males at maturity will weigh between 700 up to over 1,000, even 1,500 pounds. And we see these changes happening very early. So even at 1 year of age, when it's still a cub, males are already a third larger than females. So they pull themselves aside quite quickly. Now this pair will stay together 2 to 3 weeks if this male can keep his exclusive access to the female during that time. If a bigger, badder boy comes around, he may get pushed off. During this 2 to 3 weeks, though, they will mate repeatedly. They're going to do this because polar bears are not spontaneous ovulators, for example, like humans are. They have to mate repeatedly for ovulation to occur. So unless that male bear can keep exclusive access, it's possible that another bear may move in and actually impregnate that female. This also means that twins or triplets may in fact have different sires, because if there's another one has moved in, mating has happened again, a second ovulation has happened, that second cub may have a second or a different dad. Now what's going to happen now is something really interesting. It's something called delayed implantation. So the egg and the sperm meet, they divide a few times, become a blastocyst with, a couple hundred cells, but then they will stop growing. Those blastocysts will be free floating in the mom's uterus for a number of months and will either be aborted and resorbed if that mom's not fat enough to go on to have a successful pregnancy, or if she is fat enough, those blastocysts will implant and then continue to develop into cubs. This happens a little bit later though, and we'll get there. Now, let's move into summer. Now, I said springtime was now, so when on earth is summer? Well, it's after now, if that helps. Summer is, for most polar bears, mainly shown by a transition from being on the ice hunting seals, moving on to land. So summer may be shorter if you're a bear that lives in higher latitudes, or summer may be longer if you're a bear living in the Western Hudson Bay, for example. Now, this bear that you can see here has been an incredibly successful bear. This is a female bear who is definitely pregnant. When we see incredibly fat bears like this, these are, without exception, always female bears preparing to have cubs that year. She was likely at least 800 to 900 pounds, and as you can see, incredibly obese, which is what you want to see in a polar bear who wants to have cubs. This fat layer in the summer can be up to around 5 inches thick around the polar bear's body. And that fat layer isn't there for insulation. It's actually really hot for polar bears in the summer. That fat layer is there as calorie storage that they can pull on through the summer when they're not able to hunt, and then through the fall as they're waiting to get into their time of caloric surplus next spring again. This fat is not evenly distributed. If you look at this bear, it kind of looks like it is because she's just so fat, but it's concentrated on the bum and on the gut. So if we were to look at a bear sideways, A bear who's in really fat condition will see a very definite rise up over the hips, and then she'll have a pendulous belly as well. Now, as you can imagine, a bear in this kind of condition in the summer is not going to want to move around too much. It's very hot. They will overheat very quickly. They can move very efficiently, and they can move up to around 40 kilometers per hour, or what's around 25 miles per hour in short bursts, but then they would overheat. So like I said, summer is marked by them moving off the ice, but how long does that take and when does it happen? Well, there's no single answer to this. Bears stay on the ice as long as there is ice. If we had a year where the sea ice never left the area, the bears would never come onto land. They would stay on the sea ice. However, as that ice starts to break up in the springtime and early summer, the females with cubs are usually the first to leave. They are less tolerant of broken up ice. They don't want to be swimming with very young cubs. And those cubs are also less able to swim long distances. So when this happens, well, this can actually be into August in the Western Hudson Bay. And like I said, this was one of the more southerly areas. So there's a lot of areas, in fact, where bears may remain on the ice and not have their summer months until what we probably in the lower latitudes would call late summer. This image here is kind of showing us what that ice looks like as it starts to break up. This is a mom and a couple of cubs, and you can see she's still out on the ice. We would consider this still pretty good habitat. There's a lot of ice. Bears are still able to move from ice to ice to ice flow. And moms with cubs won't really look to leave that area until the ice to water ratio is around 50-50. So about the same amount of ice as water. And at that point, it's just difficult for them to get in between areas without having to swim. Now, you may be wondering, when did the ice break up this year? Well, it hasn't. In 2023, we are still looking at all of our bears who are being tracked being still on the ice. So this image was from, let's see, June 2nd. So 5 days ago, and we usually get updates every week or so about where the bears are. This is both the western and eastern population of bears who tend to all aggregate together when it comes to the winter and spring months. Now, in this image of Hudson Bay, the darker blue represents open water, and the lighter blue represents area where there is still ice. And you can see that all the little dots on the map there are still on the ice. Not a single one is back on land. In terms of where that sits in terms of our average, well, we are bang on average for ice cover. It's good news for the bears because, like we said, this is the most important time of year, and the spring months are when we want them to have as much time on the ice as possible. Just give you a satellite image kind of that relates to that. So this is also this past week here. You can see that along the western shore, the ice is starting to break up. There's still some coverage, and then getting into the eastern side, we still have quite a bit of ice on Hudson Bay. If you were to go to Churchill right now, so if you track the land around there, you can see where there's kind of a circle and then a line that goes straight east-west. Churchill is located right in that junction there, right as the land starts to go back up to the north. Churchill actually has a lot of open water around it and kind of feels like summer there already, but there's still quite a bit of ice on Hudson Bay. Now, if you looked at 3 weeks ago, you can see that, of course, all the bears were on ice at that time as well. There was more ice 3 weeks ago. This probably isn't a surprise. Ice is starting to break up, and it will continue to break up going into July and August. Now, look at where all those bears are located. They're all kind of moving towards the west, and that is because we have a number of currents around the area that make that a really good location for seals to make their pupping dens. That's why all the bears have moved there, so that they can get in on that seal pup action. Concentration like this, where all the bears are together, usually means that ice conditions are really good, so we're glad to be seeing that for the bears this year. I'm looking forward to the summer when I'm up in Churchill in July and August and the bears are starting to come off the ice, hopefully seeing a lot of bears like that image we saw with really fat, healthy bears looking like they're going to have a good summer. Now, just to give you an idea what it can look like during the breakup period, this is mid-July of last year, so mid-July of 2022. And you can see that here, a lot of the ice is gone. We're just seeing an ice ledge along the south coast of the Hudson Bay there. But you can see that even with that amount of ice, because that ice is locally dense, those bears are still able to stay on the ice well into July. And last year, we didn't get our first bear on land until July 9th, and many bears were still on the ice into August. So fingers crossed those bears are going to have a good spring like that again. We have been seeing warmer than average temperatures through some of the spring, as we might expect in an El Nino year. It affects Churchill as well, but that ice condition so far has been really, really good. Now, historically, our mean time that bears would come off the ice would be actually mid-August. So we are looking at a decrease in terms of historical levels, but this is considered still a pretty good year for the bears at this moment. So there, that's showing you kind of what it looked like the last couple of years with where the ice was located, just because satellite images are fun. Well, and there's all the bears off as of mid-August last year. So that's what we're expecting to happen this year as well. That is my current best guess. So what are they going to do in the summer? Well, I said that a lot of them will be just resting on land, but they do spend time in water as well. They are exceptionally good swimmers. Take a look at those feet. And take a look at the claws within those feet. So their feet are up to around a foot across, and their claws are like little ice picks. We say that they're able to get into your boat before they can get out of it, just like they can get onto an ice floe before a seal can get off of it. They're very, very good at swimming. Because of those fat deposits, they do float really well. And the longest recorded swim was 426 miles at a single stretch. Isn't that just amazing? So we do see them in the water cooling down a lot. They're not usually doing marathon swims unless they have somewhere to be. They're mostly using the water for cooling and sometimes for play, which I'll show you in a second. Summer is mainly a time for rest. The bears will come on land. They'll move away, usually from other bears, so they're not in anybody else's way, and just distribute themselves around the coastal area. Females with cubs tend to stay away from mature males. They may actually dig down to frozen soil to cool themselves off. And during this time, they're not feeding a lot. They may be eating, but they're not getting a lot of calories. They may do things like eat goose eggs, they may eat berries, they may eat carcasses that they find. A lucky bear might end up with a washed up beluga whale carcass, for example, and that can feed a bear through the summer. But because it's so relatively warm in the summer, and that this is the time of year when the bears have the most fat on them, they're not really interested in moving too far or too fast for the most part. Last year, we had some really great viewing in the summer months, partially because there was a beluga whale carcass that had washed up on shore very close to where we go out to see beluga whales. So this was a mom and cub who were hanging around this beluga whale for quite a bit of the summer. And this next image here is going to show you, again, that good bear condition. So both the mom and the cub are showing us a nice fat bear with a rise over the back of her hips and a nice pendulous belly. So this is a great thing to see in the summer, and it's really nice and very satisfying to see these beautiful fat bears coming off the ice. Like I said, they do swim to stay cool, but they'll also swim just to have fun. When mums have a single cub, they sometimes may have two. When they have two, the cubs will play together. It's like having a couple of kids or having a kid over for a play date. But when you have one cub, that cub still has a lot of play needs, and mom is then responsible for all of the play needs of that cub. So this is them horsing around in the water. They spent some time looking for fish. They spent time splashing. They spent time tussling. They spent a lot of time with their heads in the water blowing bubbles. All of this seems like play, but play is a lot of learning what it means to be a bear. So sometimes it's learning patience, sometimes it's learning skills like that, that if this is a male bear, he's going to have to go out and fight with other males for access to breeding later on. So they start practicing some of these behaviors really early. They start practicing hunting really early. And during the 2.5 years that most cubs will spend with their moms, they get to be better and better and better at these behaviors while still being cubs. They still show a lot less patience than adults will. So that's really their summer. It's a time of resting, staying out of trouble, maybe finding some goose eggs or a beluga carcass if you're lucky, but mostly it's just waiting for the ice to come back. And that's really what fall is as well. I like this image of this bear just looking out on a little icy ledge towards the water. And I'm just imagining him saying, soon, it's coming. We know that bears are capable of smelling ice. They move towards ice formation as it's happening, and it's really amazing when you're out there watching bears that when the ice starts to freeze up and when that bay starts to get really good sized ice ledges on it, the bears will very quickly start to move through and head out onto the ice. There's not a long delay at all. Now, we'll see if this video wants to play. It's sometimes a little bit jerky, but it's going to show you how that sea ice formation happens and in what pattern it happens. So we're going to zoom into Hudson Bay here in the summer months, and you can watch from the west to the east here how that ice is just going to progress. It covers starting at the west side and moving towards the east, and then it usually happens in reverse direction in the springtime. So generally our first ice and our last ice is in the west. So it's a good location around that Churchill area for polar bears to be. September 30th is usually recognized as the sea ice minimum. So it's when we have the least sea ice, and then it starts to grow again after that point, usually reaching a point where bears can get out on the ice. It varies year to year, but end of November into early December. Until that ice forms back up, though, they are, again, still waiting. This is the time of year when NatHab and other operators, too, of course, run polar bear trips. While there are bears there at other times of year, this is considered the peak time for bear viewing opportunities because there's usually a lot of bears just kind of holed up waiting for the ice to appear. There's really interesting behavior that we do see in the fall, and this includes sparring mature males. At this time of year, male bears have very low levels of testosterone. Their testicles actually only descend in the springtime during mating season, and then the rest of the time, testosterone drops, testes go up, and they're able to coexist without fighting, which means that they can spar and engage in that kind of practice behavior without a need to actually cause damage to anybody. This kind of behavior is often shown by mature males, but we do see it in juveniles as well. And this is, I think, a really exceptional image. I know it's quite dark. There was a lot of overhanging cloud cover, as there often is in the fall in Churchill. But there were just so many bears aggregating and hanging around, including a lot of sub-adults who are often very playful and curious individuals. I think it's the only time I've ever gotten 5 bears standing together in a single image like that. Presumably also unrelated bears. Usually when you see a group of bears together, it's a mom and cubs like we can see here, or a couple of mature males who are perhaps engaging in some sparring behavior. Now this mom and cubs, they're not sparring. You can see how alert they are being. Because of these bears coming into a small area in pretty big numbers, one of the risks for a mom with cub are actually the mature males that are around. So mom's in the middle there, and she is keeping her eye open for those mature males, because males will sometimes be predators of cubs, especially at this time of year, but it can happen at any time where they encounter each other. So in this next image, they've noticed an approaching male. It was a big one, And the moment they were able to get up and sniff it and notice it, they actually turned around and just left the area. Now, these cubs aren't looking as small as the one that we saw in the summer image, right? So that cub that we saw in the summer image would have been what we call a koi or a cub of the year, born that winter. These ones will be around 1.5 years old. You can see that they're approaching the size of mum, and they will be likely weaned in the spring, and mum will then be available again to breed and have another litter. So this is what the majority of the population is doing in the fall, but there is another group of individuals who are doing something else. Oh, there's some more mums and cubs. So let's just look at where some of these bears were last fall. So this is an image of early December of 2022, showing us what's going on with bears. So you can see that the ice formation is happening there. So on the left-hand side, the west, we're seeing bears moving onto that light blue ice formation. But there's a number of bears who are still on land. Now, those aren't lazy bears. They're not just waiting to head out. Those are the females who would have bred in the springtime and are now pregnant because they have maintained a good body condition through the summer. Their blastocyst has gone on to implant and begin a pregnancy. And those bears will not be heading out onto the ice until much, much later. So just to give you an idea whether this was normal last year, so this was December of last year. You can see those bears heading out on the ice. This was considered kind of a sort of average year in terms of the start of the sea ice. Early December is a pretty okay time for bears to be heading out on ice. We did see a lot of lacking ice. So in the center of Hudson Bay, that would normally at that time of year already had ice coverage on it. Whereas last year we weren't seeing ice coverage through the center of Hudson Bay there, but we were seeing good development of ice along the south coast. That led to really stable formations of ice that bears were able to access even in some cases beginning in mid-November. All right, but for those bears who are not able to go out there, they are going to head into a structure like this. This is an unused, at this time, polar bear maternity den. So they are dug into peats or gravel ridges and usually reused year after year after year by many bears. They are going to go into those in the fall, those pregnant females, and they are going to, once they settle in and the snow blows over and seals the entrance to the den, they are going to have a 60-day gestation before giving birth to a very small cub. Now, at that time, remember that those bears came off the ice probably in July, possibly early August if they were lucky. They've been fasting through August, fasting through September, fasting through October, fasting through November. In November, early December, they're going to enter this den. They're going to fast in December. They are going to give birth in January. They are going to fast in January. They will fast in February, all the while lactating. So they may spend 240 days fasting while they are off the ice, while they are pregnant, while they are lactating. And this is why the mums, those blastocysts will not implant unless mom has sufficient fat stores to be successful. And that's usually around 200 extra pounds per pregnancy. If she has less than 200 extra pounds on her body, she will not be able to successfully sustain that pregnancy. So the average weight of a female when she enters the den is 635 pounds. And then over the winter, she will lose 280 pounds, again, without eating. So she's not hibernating, she's just creating that safe space for cubs to be born and then to grow up to a sufficient size to move out towards Hudson Bay. Now, all of this in the Churchill area is happening in Wapusk National Park. This is the world's largest known polar bear maternity denning area, which is why it's a protected space by the Canadian government. These bears have to go often quite a ways inland to get to the areas where their dens are located, where there is sufficient peat, because along the shore it's just kind of rocky and sandy, nowhere to den. And then come the springtime, so take a look at where these bears are, not springtime, sorry, late winter, bears are going to be out on the ice. And this, by April, is going to include our females who had denned as well. So around the March, April time, you can see that all of these collared bears or track bears are off land and onto ice again, telling us that whether their pregnancy was successful or not, they have moved back out to once again start eating and break their very, 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 very long fast. And they are going to be now hunting adult ring seals when they are out in the winter. The hunting success, as I noted, is lower in the winter, but they are still able to catch seals, though it may not be nearly as often. Instead of looking for those seal pups, they instead have to hunt at the intersection of their habitats, so where the seals have to come up to breathe and where the bears can stick their heads in the water. Only around 10% of hunting attempts are successful, but that is, in most cases, enough to sustain the bears until they get back into that April, May, June time of year when pupping is happening again. So there's a bear hunting. Coming up in the next slide here, we used to think in early days of bear science that this was a resting bear. We now know that this is a very active hunting bear. So most bear hunting looks like this. Usually it's not very dramatic until the last half second or so. They're watching for the seal as it's coming out of its breathing hole to catch a breath of air, because as they're coming up, they're going to push a little wave of water ahead of them. And for those bears, that's the only warning that they're going to get, that they have to be ready to jump, grab the seal, and then pull it out of the water. Cubs are not able to hunt as often. They're not able, they don't. They have a hard time sitting still. But we know that when cubs do hunt, they're just as successful as adults are. So they learn very quickly how to catch those seals. Now, through the long winter, they do have ways of staying warm in the cold. The fat that they carry is an insulator, but remember that as we're kind of continuing through the summer and then into the fall and through the winter, they're not going to start increasing their fat again until we get into the springtime. So fat has to not be the best insulator. Their hair is actually doing the bulk of the insulation for this bear and keeping them warm. The hair is in a double layer. There's an undercoat as well as guard hairs. And that fat fur combination is so effective at keeping a bear warm and insulated that a resting bear who's not throwing out a lot of warm air through its nose while moving is virtually invisible to infrared cameras. You can see a few hot spots around their nose and around the pads of their feet and a little bit of their armpits. And that's about it. Now, I did mention that there were cubs born, and I want to show you a picture of what those cubs look like. Oh, they're just showing you there the hollow structure of the hair is how it's so insulative. But let's look at something even cuter. This is a newborn polar bear cub. Now, obviously, this is not a photo of a bear in the wild. This is a photo of a bear in the zoo, because that's the easiest way to get a photo of a newborn polar bear cub. So like I said, it's around 60 days of gestation, born around the new year. And then after they are born, they'll remain in the den for another 3 months. They're only around 1 to 2 pounds at birth, and they will go to be around 20 to 30 pounds about 3 months later when they leave the den and head out onto the ice with mom. Giving us some of the cutest pictures ever known. So they emerge around February or March, usually kind of in the mid-March time. Spend some time acclimating to the temperatures before heading out onto the ice, because remember, mom has been fasting for up to 240 days. And she wants to get out and also avail herself of the seal pup smorgasbord with her cubs. So this is the critical time to get the calories back, and it's why we, on top of the breeding and the feeding, that we recognize this time of year happening right now as the most important time for bears, because those moms with the cubs have to get out and have to be able to then feed their cubs. That's not my image, but it sure is a nice one, isn't it? So that cub is going to have a lucky meal that day, and he's likely will have learned something from mom about how to hunt as well. So I know I've taken us pretty close to the top of the hour here, but looks like we still have a few minutes for questions. I'll hand things over to Rob to facilitate that.
All right, thank you. Now, before we start in with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So, do we know how big the footpad of a polar bear is by diameter, maybe?
So polar bear foot pads, they're a little bit longer than wide. Width can be up to around 12 inches wide, and then the length can be up to around 16 inches. They're big, is what I can tell you. They are huge, and if you ever have an opportunity to, in Churchill and in other areas around the world that do bear interpretation, they sometimes have a cast of a polar bear pad, and if you just go stick your hand on that, it's really amazing to see the difference between your hand and the size of a polar bear pad. I can actually cycle back really quickly here and take us to, I had an image of, oh, there we go, kind of the relative size of a human's hand versus the paws of a polar bear. Just massive, massive things.
Wow, that's amazing. So, how long does the polar bear mom nurse her cubs for?
So polar bear moms will nurse their cubs as long as they are with them, though they will spend less and less time nursing them. Oops, pardon me. Let's go back into the slideshow here. There we go. They'll spend less and less time nursing as they get older. So how long a cub stays with its mom will depend a little bit on where they are and what the local conditions are. In the Western Hudson Bay, this has historically been a really productive area, and in the past, cubs actually only stayed with their moms for a year and a half, because after that year and a half mark, they were already so big, they were ready to go off on their own. Conversely, in the high Arctic, we see bears who may stay with their moms for 3.5 years, because conditions up there are much more challenging. It takes more time to put weight on. They have to stay with their moms for longer until they're ready to be independent. Now we see the average time is around 2.5 years. So in the Western Hudson Bay and in most of the populations, 2.5 years marks the time where they will stay with their mom, and that's also when they're weaned. So usually it looks like mom and cub are out feeding on seals. Cubs are 2.5 years old. They're pretty big. Big male polar bear comes along and says, I would like some special time alone with your mom. The cubs get pushed off, and that is the last time that they see mom. So mom will then go on to breed with the new male, will go on to have new cubs, and that is the end of their mother-cub relationship. But right up until that time, she will likely still be nursing. And like I said, that nursing happens less and less as they get older, but you will see 2-year-old cubs still nursing on mom. And because of that size discrepancy between the males and females, sometimes the male cubs are bigger than the mom while they are nursing, which is just a really bizarre look, but that's how polar bears make it work.
So, their dens, you said they get reused. Are they reused by the same bear or other bears?
Yeah, so dens are reused, and they're reused sometimes by the same bear. Remember, a bear will only need the den on average every 3 years, because that's how often that they are reproducing unless they lose their cub for some reason. Those dens may also be used by that bear's female relations, like for example, their female offspring. But generally, each bear will have some number of dens that they use in the same general area, and they may reuse the den over and over and only ever go to one den, or she may have a selection of 2, 3, or 4 dens that she kind of rotates her way through, making choices that we don't fully understand about why one is better than the other, but for whatever reason, she may choose one instead of the other.
How are their eyesight?
Their eyesight is approximately equal to humans. So saying that of all their exceptional senses, their eyesight is not it. They have exceptional noses. We know that they are able to track females in estrus from, maybe 20 miles away. They are able to smell the scent of a seal or smell the scent of ice from possibly, 30 or 40 miles away. They can see a researcher standing, a few hundred feet away, and that's kind of about the extent of it. Now, they do have slightly different vision than we do in terms of the color profile that they're able to see. So humans have 3 separate types of cones that differentiate colors, one of which is green. Polar bears are lacking the green cone, so they are not able to see the color green as something different from the black and white landscape. So, little interesting tidbit there. As you can imagine, they don't have a great big need to see a lot of green and to pick out green, whereas those of us who live on land and make our living finding plants and, foraging do have to be able to pick green out of, say, red berries.
Great, thanks for addressing that. So we know that global warming is affecting us, of course, and we hear that summer ice is disappearing. If it does, how will that impact the bears?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not a hard one to answer in terms of the facts because we've got great evidence, but it's a hard one to answer because it's not good news for the bears, is what we know. And you may have seen recent headlines that we're expecting summer ice in the Arctic to disappear by 2050. Some estimates put it as soon as 2030, which is, really not very far away at all. Now, for bears, summer ice is not actually necessarily important to them. Their time, like their critical time to be on the ice, is the springtime. They require a certain number of days on the ice to consume enough calories. We know that for every 10 days that a bear gets less on the ice, so if the ice leaves 10 days earlier, for example, they have to carry an extra 20 kilograms on them to make up for that. So they have to be more efficient hunters. Something that we're seeing in the Western Hudson Bay and in the Hudson Bay overall is that we are seeing a decrease in sea ice year over year, and decadal trends are very much, we're losing around 12 to 14% of our sea ice every decade. That is having a noticeable and measurable effect on the bears, and we're primarily seeing it in a change in the bears' numbers. So the most recent population estimate of bears in the Western Hudson Bay is just over 600 individuals. If you compare that to the first population estimates, there were over 1,200 bears in that population. So when I showed that map earlier of the different subpopulations, we do see those southernmost populations being the ones that are most impacted by that decrease in the amount of ice. Now, I should say that conversely, there have been some areas that have not been good polar bear populations historically because there's been too much ice. Bears like annual ice. They like ice that comes in every year and then disappears every year because that's the ice that seals need. In ice where the ice is, 5, 6, 10 feet thick and seals can't use that habitat, bears haven't been able to use that habitat either. As we're seeing a decrease in the amount of ice across the board, some of the areas that have historically had too much ice now have the right amount of ice, and we're seeing increases in polar bear populations in those areas. So it's a very big question, and we could talk about this probably all day about the evidence that's out there and what's happening in individual populations. The overall trend is not going to be beneficial to the bears because the ice is their habitat. They need ice to survive, but individual populations of bears may have some benefits to this overall trend.
Thank you for addressing that. Unfortunately, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'm going to throw it back to you for your closing comments.
Right. Thanks, everybody, for coming by today and hearing about bears. I hope that you learned something or been inspired by something or otherwise just really enjoyed looking at cute photos of bears. I'm going to be seeing the bears soon in July, so I'll say hi for you. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Eleanor, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I would also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.